Good morning, everybody. I think I'm going to get going, otherwise we're going to get behind. I'd like to start by thanking the organizing committee for inviting me to talk at this event, but I'm not so sure that I want to thank them for the topic they've given me. It's really a complex issue, and I started off by thinking, it's going to be quite simple, but there's so many dimensions of lameness in broilers that it was particularly difficult to prepare for. So what I'm going to talk about today is this whole issue of lameness, and when one starts looking in the literature, you'll see it's called leg problems, leg weakness, leg disorders, and lameness are all terms that are used interchangeably. It is probably true to say that lameness is less of an issue than it was a decade ago, principally because the genotypes have changed. But I think we probably underestimate it. And I found some very recent information that says that between 20 and 30% of all European broiler flocks suffer from some form of lameness. And I would imagine that it's pretty much the same across the globe. So it's a serious issue that we need to take seriously. I tried to split lameness up into some kind of rational way of describing it, and I decided that there were three major areas that one needed to consider. The first is there are acute issues, and these are the acute skeletal abnormalities that we bring about basically through poor nutrition. And by that I mean calcium and phosphorus nutrition. Then there are some chronic issues, and these are the issues that we used to see a lot of, we don't see as many of now, but those were tendon issues, ligaments, articulation, the growth plates, and then nervous issues. So these are much more, or much less acute, but they and much better under control than they perhaps were. And then I apologize to the veterinary profession for calling these last group insidious. And these are bone and joint infections that are largely caused by some kind of pathogen. And why I call them insidious is they kind of creep up on you, and you don't realize you have a problem until it's too late. Why is lameness important? The first thing is, from a welfare point of view, if you create pain in a bird, you have a welfare issue. The trouble is, the minute you have pain, it restricts normal and natural movement. And from our point of view as poultry producers, that actually prevents our birds from eating and drinking normally. And that has negative aspects to it. If birds go off their legs, which is exactly what happens during lameness, it has a direct impact on the product quality. So we get a lot of breast blisters, scratches, and inflammation of the carcass. These lead to downgrades or consumers who do not like what they see when they purchase our product. And all of these aspects reduce profitability. And we've just heard the Honourable MP saying he wants to double the profit in the poultry industry. As an outsider, I think that's maybe a little generous, but we certainly don't want to lose money. So the thing about skeletal abnormalities is they are generally indicated by a poor gait. So birds do not walk in the manner which you would expect them to do. And the trouble with poor gait is it's associated with high levels of morbidity. Those are birds that just do not perform. And in worst case scenario, mortality. Gait has become a major measure for welfare across the globe. So if you have welfare audit on your farm, the first thing they come and look for is a gait score. Okay, so our problem in the modern bird is that lameness is exacerbated by a number of things. And the first, of course, is that because our birds grow faster, we have these rapid and fast early growth rates. and that has an impact on leg health. Final body weight has an issue, or is an issue, in that the heavier the bird is, so locomotion tends to decrease. And this differs from market to market. I was in Korea last week and they slaughter birds at 1.6 kilos. Japan the week before, and they slaughter birds at 3 kilos. So it's a very different situation in different countries. Obviously, if your nutrition is inappropriate, so you've got it wrong, you're going to exacerbate leg problems. An issue we tend to forget about is gut health. If you have a poor gut health or a gut health issue on a farm, you are definitely going to have an impact on lameness. As I mentioned before, we cannot rule out infectious diseases, and I'm going to deal with that in a little detail in a moment. And then, like everything in the poultry industry, if you have poor management practices on farms, you are going to see more lameness. So in order to resolve the issue, we need to look at this problem in a holistic manner. What I'm going to talk about in this particular talk, because time is limited, is nutrition and feed-induced lameness rather than all the other aspects. Let's have a little bit of a starting point by looking at our modern genotypes. We know that they have shorter and shorter growing cycles. What this means is that that skeleton has to carry more and more weight at an earlier age. And the thing we often forget is that the gait of our birds has changed, and I'm going to show you what I mean in a moment. I want to tell you, though, that our primary breeding companies, and there are only 2 of them, have done a remarkable job at reducing leg abnormalities. The first thing I want to do is show you the world's most overused slide. This is from Martin Zaytoff, just showing you how the broiler chicken has developed. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but what I want to show you is that the bird, the 1957 bird at 56 days of age, and my guess is I can't show you with a pointer, is the bird on the bottom left-hand side. When she walks, she trips down the house a bit like a model, a ramp model. She minces along. This guy on the bottom here, at 4.2 kilos at 56 days of age, he is like a sumo wrestler. He waddles along. So 20 years ago, the gait issue had everything to do with knees. Currently, the gait issue largely has to do with the hip. So everything has changed thanks to the genotype. When I tell you that the breeding companies have done an amazing job at reducing leg abnormalities, this is data from Aviagen, and you can see the blue dots on the slide were the period from 1992 to 2006, how through using a lexoscope they were able to reduce the number of leg abnormalities in the population. Significantly, in 2008, they got a new and better machine. And guess what? They carried on reducing leg abnormalities in their birds. This is the good news, is that the birds are better than they ever were before. It's probably worth just reviewing what the skeleton requires in terms of nutrition. And I don't need to remind you in any great detail, if you have a poor skeleton, everything else is wrong. So it is an important component of the overall health of the bird. Part of skeletal development is cartilage development, and we can't ever forget that. So we require a robust skeleton, not only so that the birds perform well on farm, but so that when we process those birds in the processing plant, we get product of acceptable quality. And as I've said to you, as the growth rate increases, skeletal development seems to have become more important. And having said all of this, it's quite remarkable how little we actually know about the exact nutrient requirements of a fast-growing broiler chicken, in terms of calcium and phosphorus in particular. And I'm going to address that in a moment. Just to remind you that 99% of the calcium and 80% of the phosphorus in the in the bird resides in the skeleton. And when you do tibial ash, about 30% of that ash is actually phosphorus. We all know that calcium and phosphorus interact with each other both before, during, and after absorption. And mostly, it's a case of high calcium level inhibiting the uptake of phosphorus, but the opposite does occur as well. We need to bear in mind that vitamin D is essential because it maintains the complex balance between calcium and phosphorus, and particularly the metalloprotein carrier that is involved with the absorption of these two minerals. Skeletal development begins some 12 days before the egg is laid. In other words, the egg of the broiler chick, because that is when nutrient deposition begins in the yolk. So we've got to look at this thing in terms of its entire production cycle. Bone calcification within the egg occurs rapidly, but it plateaus at about 19 days of age, so just after candling. And the reason for this is there's plenty of calcium. Remember that the bird is able, or the embryo is able, to draw calcium from the shell and use it for skeletal development. What actually happens is that the other minerals begin to become limiting, particularly phosphorus and zinc. There's a problem here, though. It's quite easy for us to deprive an embryo of minerals. So if we want to induce a zinc deficiency in the embryo, all we do is feed the hen a diet that is deficient in zinc. However, the opposite is not true. If you want to boost the mineral levels in the egg, it doesn't seem to be possible. What is enough is enough. Don't think you're going to get enough plus 15% by adding 15% more zinc in your breeding hen diet, because it doesn't seem to work that way. So we're very poor at increasing the vitamin and mineral levels in the egg. We've not successful at that at all. Fast-growing embryos, and many of our modern genotypes are exactly this, often exceed the mineral deposition capacity of the system. And in young hens, we tend to find eggs that are produced with low levels of minerals and vitamins, for that matter. So the net result of this is we get a porous bone structure at hatch. At hatch, when that bird arrives on the farm, it's got a slightly friable bone. It's not exactly what we want as broiler farmers. So these bones are relatively poorly mineralized. Why the age thing exists, we do not know at this point. We just know that it happens. Once the bird is hatched, rapid bone formation begins at about 2 days of age and extends through to 18 days of age. But the bulk of bone mineralization occurs in that period, 2 to 11 days of age. So it's the starter period that is absolutely critical. If you want to ensure good skeletal development, you have to look after it during the first week of life. This is some very interesting work that was presented at the Australian Poultry Science meeting last year by Torres. And what they did is they fed 5 different levels of calcium, starting at 3 grams per kilo and going up to 10 grams per kilo. And they then measured the degree of calcification in the bone on each day. And you'll see, and I can't use the point, I'm afraid, but in the first day or two, it didn't matter how much calcium was in the diet. No true bone calcification took place. But if one moves to the right-hand side of this table, you'll see that there wasn't a significant difference between 8 and 10 grams of calcium in the diet. So during the first period, you probably need at least 8 grams per kilo of calcium. Some data published by Rosalina Angel, who measured the degree of mineralization in the bones of broilers. And you can see here that in the first 10 days, about 28% of the mineralization occurred. It doesn't sound like very much, but if you look at what happens at 48 days, we just slightly over 33%. So you can see from commercial broiler production point of view, the vast majority of the crucial mineralization occurs in that first 10-day period. So we need to bear that in mind when we start designing diets. Okay, so then along came this most amazing product called phytase. And what we found is that phytase changes just about everything we thought we knew about calcium and phosphorus. It does a whole lot of things. Most importantly, it increases the apparent retention of calcium and phosphorus in the broiler. Our understanding about exactly how this all occurs is far from complete, although there is a lot of research being carried out in this area at the moment. What we do know is that our requirements differ depending on whether we're measuring bone mineralization or whether we're measuring growth and feed conversion ratio. Tend to find we need slightly more calcium and phosphorus for bone mineralization than we do for growth. The other thing we know, that if we feed calcium levels that are too high, two things happen. The first is we actually depress feed intake and thus performance. And the second thing we know is if we have high calcium levels in the diet, we suppress the phytase enzyme activity. So these are factors that need to be borne in mind. I'm afraid that the timer clock is also not working here, so if, Mr. Chairman, if I'm running over time, please wave at me. Are you waving at me? All right. There was an excellent review article conducted by Faridi in France, who looked at diets with and without phytase at different calcium and phosphorus levels. And to our left are the phosphorus levels in the diet, and along the bottom line are the calcium levels. And what I wanted to show you, in cases where there was no phytase, they had, at best, 44% ash content in the tibia. When we start to add phytase to the diet, and I've just chosen a random value, 7 grams of calcium and 4 grams of phosphorus, can you see that we've got 60% ash in our bone minerals? So a little bit of phytase makes a phenomenal difference to skeletal development. Okay? Phenomenal difference. The good news for bad nutritionists is this hides many of your mistakes. I said to you that calcium depresses feed intake. This is some work from Korea. And what they did is they fed different levels of calcium in the diet, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 grams per kilo. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail because you will have access to these slides, but I just want to point out to you that as the calcium level increases, the 35-day weight decreases and the feed conversion ratio gets worse. Interestingly enough, there was not a huge difference to the tibia ash percentage or the breaking strength. But I just want to show you this is a really clear example of how a high calcium level depresses performance. So when we formulate our diets, we need to decide how we're going to do it. And there's some complications in the system. The first is our system of measurements are not interchangeable, but there are many of them. All right? And this confuses myself and many other nutritionists. Digestibility is what we're really interested in. It is true that we can measure the non-phytate phosphorus in the diet. It's a straightforward technique, but it's a really poor indicator of our digestibility. And this is some data from Ravi Ravindran, and he shows the non-phytate phosphorus level in the left-hand column there. So monocalcium phosphorus is 100% non-phytate phosphorus, but it's only 85% digestible. If one looks at soybean meal, it's 33% non-digestible phosphorus, but it is 80% digestible. So you have huge differences between non-phytate phosphorus, the chemical measure, and the biological measure. As you know, we use phytase in pretty much all our broiler diets, and we know that the efficacy is dependent upon a number of things. The first is the type and the dose of phytase that we use. Second is the level of substrate, the level of phytate phosphorus in the diet. Third is the time that we have available for the enzyme to work. And I'm not going to belabor this, but we do know that young birds utilize phytase, or we have a much greater efficacy of phytase in young birds than we do in older birds. And by young birds, I mean in the first week to 10 days. I just want to remind you that phytase is a very a simple process if you understand it. It's a rate-limiting reaction, which means that the reaction slows down as the amount of substrate declines. But there's an issue, and that is in broilers, this only occurs in the acidic environment of the gizzard and proventriculus, and we've got about 35 minutes. The original natufos, or 3-phytase, gave us this kind of a result. If we feed high calcium levels, you can see it has quite a negative impact. If we were to go to a better quality phytase, the second generation 6-phytases, you can see you do better still. But really, the secret is double your dose of phytase, and you have this huge impact on the performance of this enzyme. So whatever you do, think about doubling your phytase levels. There are many different phytases on the market, and I'm not going to go through the slide other than to say it was published independently at Texas A&M University, and there are 4 different products there, and I want to tell you that there are very, very few differences, if at all, between the different products. So we have an excellent array of very good products on the market. The other thing that is worth just pointing out is that if you measure the inositol phosphate in your diets, which is what I did here, I was able to show that there was 15% more inositol phosphate in my starter than there was in my finisher diet. Now, if you use a single number when you formulate your diets using phytase, you're probably making a mistake. So clearly, the use of a single matrix value is flawed if you want to optimize your your skeletal development. So what I want to suggest is that you think about this thing slightly differently, and you calculate a yield of phosphorus depending upon the level of destruction achieved by the enzyme that you're using, and 70% is probably a good number if you're using a double dose, and you combine that with an amount of substrate you have in your diet. Calculate your own value. Do not necessarily follow the supplier's recommendation. Just moving on, this is what the current practice for calcium and phosphorus is. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but you will note that 2018 values versus the Aviagen value from this year are pretty much identical. 9, 8.7, 7.6. I'm intrigued to know how the primary breeders think we can measure 7.9 grams of calcium, but that's for another day. Rosalina Angel reported on the values given by AgriStats on practical US diets, and you can see they're pretty much the same. So we've got high calcium and phosphorus levels. If one starts looking into the literature, and this is the data published by the INRA team, you can see that the starter value, they've got the bird age from 0 to 10 days, the calcium is about 9, and the available phosphorus is about 4.3. It's pretty much exactly the same as the breeder company recommendations. However, thereafter, you'll see that the calcium and phosphorus are reduced dramatically. Maryland University have published their own set of data this year, and if we look at the starter, you'll see that they've actually got slightly higher calcium and phosphorus values than the primary breeding companies recommend. I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, but I would point out to you how the calcium and phosphorus reduces towards older birds. And this is where the majority of your very expensive phosphorus is used. So the bottom line is look after the birds in the first week and then think about saving money as the birds get older. You can't ignore protein and energy when one looks at carcass quality or skeletal quality. And I'm not going to talk about the lameness that is induced by vitamins and minerals that all the classic textbooks talk about. These are well-described pathologies. And if you follow the primary breeder guidelines and use good premixes, you should probably not see these issues. So I want to end off by just talking about some management and feeding issues. And the first thing is, as we've already said, the development of broilers begins during incubation. And there's some problems if you don't incubate properly. You have poorly reabsorbed yolk sacs, you have smaller intestinal organs, but most importantly, you have a reduction in calcification of the skeleton. So if you overheat your birds in the incubator, your eggs in the incubator, you're likely to pick up leg problems later in life. Brooding is really important. Anything you do that is bad in brooding reduces feed intake and reduces physical activity. And these two things have a negative impact on not only gut health, but also bone, cartilage, and tendon development. Just from a feed management point of view, we all know that early access to feed and water stimulates the development of the gastrointestinal tract and the bird. We also know that we feed high protein diets. We stimulate intestinal development. These are key to normal development. But we want to have good gut development so that we can have a good microbiota and prevent invasion by harmful bacteria. And this is a key component of gut health. The reason why I'm talking about this is that one of the major causes of lameness, and this is one of the insidious causes, is bacterial chondronecrosis and osteomyelitis, basically known as BCO. This affects about 1.5% of all broiler flocks over 30 days of age. If you have a really bad epidemic, it can go as high as 30% of that flock. But the issue here is that in order to prevent this, we require strong growth plates and articular surfaces. This is the cartilage. And if we can enhance the collagen cross-linking, we have lower incidences of these microfractures, and these microfractures are what get infected by various bacteria and cause leg problems. These pathogens penetrate the gut, and they reach susceptible growth plates via the blood. And once they're there, we have osteochondrosis. We see this particularly in the proximal, femoral, and tibial growth plates. So this is the dreaded femoral necrosis we see. And we also see it in the thoracic vertebrae. So if you, as a nutritionist, can ensure good gut health, you are going to help prevent or limit this condition from occurring. If you have a malabsorption brought about by poor gut health, you are going to aid or induce rickets and the osteoporosis of the proximal femur. And then there's the other issue, that is if you have poor litter quality, you have flushing and wet litter. Now what I didn't realize is how important wet litter was, because if you've got wet litter, you've got footing instability, and the minute you've got footing instability, you have trauma to your growth plates, and it exacerbates the whole lameness issue. So the minute birds can't stand properly, they get contact dermatitis, and I read a negative emotional state and a fear of human beings. So whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it sounded good. So I want to end with a couple of quick take-home messages. Remember that both profit and the welfare status of your birds are addressed through lameness. If you can reduce your lameness, you will improve on both of these areas. It is a multifactorial problem. There's not a silver bullet. You're not going to fix it by doing one thing. The whole issue is not helped by modern practice, rapidly growing broilers at high stocking densities. So sound farm management is required. Okay? Absolutely critical that we ensure good early skeletal development, and particularly in the first 7 days of life. And in order to do this, we need to use phytase correctly, and I would suggest that you consider using a double or a triple dose, because that is when phytase works its best. And then use a well-formulated premix. It doesn't cost very much in the big picture, particularly during the starter phase. It's really important to avoid any form of gut health issue, and we have really good motivation to address the issue of lameness and the impact it has on our industry. But it does require a concerted effort by all parties involved. Thank you very much.